Hello and welcome again to another installment of ELFH, and we're talking about the needs analysis. So I just wanted to recap a little bit and let you know, calibrate. Where are we today? So thinking about the needs analysis process, we have talked about the types of needs. We have the four, technically five, but we're focusing on four only. The global strategic, we are not really focusing too much just because they are too large. But for our purposes, we have looked at those four types, and then we have talked about the purposes of analysis. We need to analyze data so we can determine whether the need exists, kind of that point A, point B, and the gap in between the two of them. We also talked about the process. How are we going to do that? And we talked about the proposal. We talked about the initial interview. And from that data, deciding whether or not we needed to continue and gather more information, or if we needed to stop at that point and validate or negate the need. And after doing that, we defined that we needed to continue doing research, or when we do need to do more research. We go ahead and get data. And so we have talked about techniques to gather data, surveys, focus groups, interviews, observations, etc. Then we talked about the quantitative data gathering and analysis via surveys and so forth, as well as the qualitative data gathering and analysis. And we talked about how we interview people, or how we conduct focus groups, or how we do observations. And they are, for the most part, qualitative. And then, of course, how we analyze that data. We talked about the different codes and how we group data, how we categorize data, etc. So we looked at the results of either one or both of our types, qualitative or quantitative data analysis, gathering and analysis. And then we talked about the results and analysis, and then we're supposed to conduct a report, and that is what is going to say, yes, there is a need, or no, there isn't a need, and then what to do, next steps. And that is precisely at that point is where our job ends as needs analysis assessors or consultants. Where we are right now is talking about the qualitative data gathering and analysis. So let me just jump right into that. And so we have different types of data, talking about qualitative data. So we are, for the most part, talking about what people say, what people think, what people indicate. In the quantitative space, we usually hear that via numbers. So we can take those numbers and we can massage them via Excel, SPSS, Tableau, any of those instrumentation tools. But for the qualitative data, generally we have to read and code and do data mining and do word searches, etc. So basically we do direct observations when we are getting that qualitative data, observations of a situation without influencing or participating in any way. So we're truly letting everything play out by itself in the normal conditions. Sometimes people are inobtrusive, they are completely out of the way. Sometimes you have to be in the middle of the action. But the idea is to try to not prevent from things playing out the way they normally do, so that the observation really truly tells you what is happening. The participant observation is also the immersion itself, where you actually, as a researcher or as a data gatherer, you participate in the production. Sometimes that is very helpful, because then you can understand what limitations exist. We can observe a process, but sometimes when we participate in the process, we can see a different thing, a different side of things. We can also conduct interviews. During the interviews, we let those people that are responding to our questions pretty much freely explain or tell us how they feel. So this is becoming a little bit more subjective, because it's truly how the world rotates on each person's mind. And so you can possibly be gathering information around the same situation, but you will hear it from two different perspectives when you talk to two different people. So that's something that requires a little bit more interpretation, and you as a researcher have to understand that you have to create boundaries. When you are going to talk to different people and you want to collect data around a specific item, you have to ask very direct questions, and also you have to, when you are analyzing, you have to have the ability to separate the feelings, or at least compartmentalize the feelings, so that the interpretation doesn't get shaded by your personal interpretation in some cases, or even that of different participants of the interviews. Then we have the surveys. Believe it or not, we still include the surveys as a qualitative piece, but that is only when we are sending surveys that have free text, where people can freely explain what they're talking about. And I have warned you before, or I have at least mentioned it in other videos, that the difficulty of including free text on a survey is that usually decreases the amount of response rate. People are less engaged in typing what they really feel or need or believe in surveys. They don't have time for that. And that's usually more the technology that is driving us today more than anything. They probably have, especially if they have a negative feeling about something, they will want to speak about it. But the typing takes too much time, and so they usually will be taken away because they are interrupted by something else, or something else grabs their attention. So we have to be careful. And then, of course, the focus groups, which is also a major way of us collecting data. And the challenge with the focus groups is sometimes if you have a leader in that group, they can sway information. But nonetheless, that is data that we can collect and we can then analyze from a qualitative perspective. So as far as the qualitative analysis, as you can see on the screen, we need to review the data. And usually we don't do it one time, we do it quite a few times for different reasons. We need to become familiar with the data. We need to see if there are trends. We need to see what challenges or what errors are there. Are people just copying and pasting? Are we seeing the same response exactly spelled the same way? Sometimes one big telltale sign is when you see in fill in the blanks where people have copied some basic script, there is a grammatical error, and that grammatical error will appear in everybody's response. So sometimes you have to be careful, and you have to confirm whether that data is still pristine, or if you need to discard it or to throw it out. You need to create initial categories. So when you start dealing with that qualitative data, find those themes with words, with phrases, with certain topics that they mention. So those become your categories. And depending on the topic, sometimes it'll be easier, sometimes it'll be more difficult, because those words are going to be used multiple times. And so you don't necessarily know from what angle they are using them. So it can be tricky, but that is usually the first way to go about it, finding those categories by words. Then we have to create the codes that we apply to categories. For example, when we are talking about productivity, and we have tools, and then we have raw material. The tools could be coded 1, the raw material could be coded 2, and so on and so forth. If you have more codes, more themes, then you add codes to those themes, and then you can translate them into numbers. However, you still need to read them, and that's the difference between the qualitative and the quantitative data, that this is a very, very manual process. Then you read and code your data. And so what I mean by that is sometimes we identify, say, raw material, so that is coded 2, like I just mentioned a second ago. And so in that example, then you need to begin reading each one of the statements that are coded as 2, raw material, to understand exactly what the issue is with raw material. Is it the lack of, is it the quality of it, is it the insufficiency of it, or is it the dissatisfaction around using a certain raw material that creates a problem for the worker? Very, very unique example, but I'm just trying to paint a quick picture about that. Once we have understood that, that's why we have to read and code that data. We have to review that after a period of time to see if the codes need to be redone, or need to be changed, or need to be revised, period. Then we also have to develop charts to show the presence of themes. That's when it starts taking a little bit of a shape of a quantitative analysis, but it is still graphics that are being drawn from qualitative understanding. So you have to understand the difference between the two. Then we need to identify overarching themes. So we have, say, if we have coded 10 or 15 topics, we have to figure out what those overarching themes are. For example, all those related to people, human capital, all of those related to instrumentation, all of those related to products, and so on and so forth. So those are the overarching themes. And then we have to summarize our findings, and that is probably the most time consuming because we not only have taken the time to code, categorize, then we coded, then we separated, we reviewed, we understood the data, and now we are summarizing our findings. So for the analyzing the qualitative data, usually we use descriptive statistics. So to use descriptive statistics, we have to do some coding. And that, as I was saying, you have categories and then you do numbers for those codes. And also sometimes you do the content analysis as far as what they're talking about or what words or what language they are using to describe some themes and the meaning of them, the frequency in which they use words, etc. And then the analysis of the narrative, how they are talking about it, and this is more psychological than anything. Usually when people are very frustrated, their narrative is going to be a little bit more stern, perhaps dry, and even accusatory at some point. And so sometimes that leads to quick typing, and that leads to mistakes or grammatical errors, etc. Certain words, in some cases, people have used cuss words, and that is, a little bit uncomfortable to deal with, but it is a part of the job. So know that that happens. And of course, if you get into cultural aspects or social aspects or political context, etc., it can be very, very difficult to deal with depending on who you are including in the research. So those are things to consider. Now, I like to talk about three different processes for the coding. So once you have found the categories, you begin coding. You have three different ways of doing it. You have the theory-based coding, which is essentially a way to apply the theoretical framework of the research you are doing. So if you were talking about research itself, if you are going for a company that is doing breakthroughs in nanotechnology, you want to look at the theory of nanotechnology, for example, and then based on that, use coding, whether it's contextual framework, whether it's testing, whether it's components, etc. So depending on what the theory is talking about, you create those codes based on that. So that is very scientific, and sometimes it's socially adaptable, but generally it's very unusual because in the business area we hardly use theoretical models unless the company is a research company like McKesson, which is a pharmaceutical company. They do base a lot of their productivity or the production in research, test trials, etc. So the deductive coding essentially is that one aimed at testing the theory, and you can do that from the one-to-one relationship, if you will. Whereas the inductive coding, that is going to be more creating those categories with the data. So you are wanting to generate new theories based on the data. So in the image, for example, as you see, the green is going to generate from the networks of the other colors. And so thinking about subjects or topics, a topic is going to be generated based on what you hear from other focus groups or other people. Whereas the deductive is more, you are asking for specifics that are happening in the process or in the assembly line that are a given, and you're just asking people perspective on that. Whereas if you just ask basic questions that are very open-ended for people to express their frustration or their happiness about a certain process, that's the inductive coding process where you can start creating those themes, if you will. So somebody asks, what gets coded? And so should all questions or only the main questions be coded? And that really depends, because when you create your questions for the interviews or for the focus groups, you have to decide whether you're going to include a question that gets to test whether people are truthfully responding or they are responding to the same topic. In other words, creating a little bit of validity or reliability. Also, another question is, should we transcribe the verbalization of the questions or the responses literally? And many a times the answer is going to be no. But it really depends. In some cases, you need to do that for veracity of the data. Another question is, should observations during the interview be transcribed or not? And it's amazing, depending on the topic, once again, a lot of it depends. The best practice should usually incline us to say yes, but it really depends, because at that point it's a matter of time, it's a matter of ability, it's a matter of resources. If you have a person who is observing and a person who is transcribing, absolutely. For example, one of the things where I see these being used efficiently, and it's a little different, but it's the same process. If you go to the doctor's office, usually when you leave that appointment room and you see the doctor go to his little cubby or her cubby, you will see them with a little recorder, and they are saying what their impressions are, and so that they get recorded. Sometimes they use a little recorder, sometimes they use their computers. It really depends nowadays. Sometimes they probably will use their phone, I don't know, but on the responses. And so they will give that to somebody else, and then that person will transcribe it. And because that data needs to remain clear, sometimes the transcription is word for word. But in a matter of a research, if it's basic information, you probably don't need to capture every single word. But if it is something that requires a lot of scrutiny and a lot of research and observation, you definitely want to get those, because you're looking for those words, for those trends, for those data mining events. So some tips for coding in the qualitative analysis. So categories reflect the chosen method of analysis, we say here. So the theoretical literature, for example, existing frameworks, current data sets. So it depends. If it's a brand new topic, you will have to sometimes create those categories. But in many cases, when you have done historical data retrieval, you will see that there are some categories already established, so you can probably use those. Also, attempt to create categories that are mutually exclusive, so that pieces of data are not necessarily blending into each other, so you keep them separate. And you have to be careful about the notes, about the decisions you make with certain responses. In other words, you hear somebody talk about something that is very polarizing and you choose to transcribe it partially only, but you need to keep data as to why you chose to do that. Otherwise, when the data gets coded or when it is analyzed, it may not be you, or you may not remember, and you don't know. You will perceive that the data is incomplete, but you don't know why. So unfortunately, you will have to throw that data away. So it's very important that you keep all your notes and perspectives when you're doing that. So next, you have to develop the means for highlighting useful quotations or tips or things that you see that may help you, and that will definitely be keywords that the organization uses or understands, and you can include that in a summary report. And so that's very important, that you keep an eye for those words that are vernacular of that space. You will have to have a catch-all, so you have to have a miscellaneous category, because otherwise, you will end up with 1,000 different categories, and you can't do that. We don't have time for that. So at some point, you will have to create that catch-all category. Be sure and give yourself a lot of time, because as you can see, it does require, similar to the construction, you measure and you measure twice, and sometimes you measure 3 times before you cut. And so in this case, it's the same thing. You read the data, you internalize the data, then you code the data, and you revise the data again before you even generate any conclusion. And be careful, because when you start coding, we begin creating inferences about what the data means, and that is usually something that needs to happen at the analysis phase. And if it's not clear for us because we're still doing the coding, we shouldn't start making inferences about that kind of thing. And of course, if you're tired because it is going to be a lot of data, just come back later or have somebody else to help you, and then you can just double up. And now you're seeing what the three possible techniques for providing results. So now that we have taken the qualitative data and we have coded it, we have categorized it, we have coded it, and then we get into the analysis, how do we convey our findings? And so there are three different ways in which we can do that. The frequency count is the first one, and that is very basic. Usually using your codes, specifically numbers, you get to describe. You can even use central tendency measures for that. You can say the average of times that something has been mentioned is, or the median is, or the mode, so the number of times that something has been brought up can be, etc. The second one is the theme-based contextual description, and that's a little bit deeper. There is a little bit of understanding. So usually you're looking at the themes, and they are developed kind of like the inductive theory. So they are developed or found in the report, in your analysis, and then they usually have a contextual description of what the finding is. So look at an example. So the online professional development course was part of the analysis here. One of the contextual descriptions is the social aspect of that online course. And so that was the context within the topic, right? And then you have the third one, which is the narrative format. And that is usually what a lot of qualitative researchers end up doing, because there is a little bit of telling a story. And usually that is providing the ability to have a chronology behind it. And as you can see in the example, sometimes we need to explain the events so that it makes sense why the report is written that way, and also it sequences sometimes the events that we found to the need, and also that helps us with the prioritization. So it depends. I hope this has been informative, and there are more resources for you on the analyzing the qualitative data. I hope you access them in our course outline. But this is just to whet your appetite a little bit of the coding that we can use in the qualitative analysis. Until next time, everyone.